Teaching leadership requires awareness of self, situation, and students. The past decade has revealed a need for greater understanding of the complexity of ourselves and our students. We must work to ensure the development of empathy and understanding amongst the many differences embodied in all of us. We must foster the creativity and insight that evolves from the novelty of interacting with the diverse communities that define our world. Our students will need to lead in these complex communities, and Dr. Jennifer Bryan has spent her career helping teachers develop the awareness about their students so essential to teaching leadership. In 2001, Dr. Bryan began offering specialized gender and sexuality consultation to PreK-12 schools. Her conceptual and pedagogical models have evolved to keep pace with the social changes occurring every day. Her work helps us better understand our students and how to help them learn to lead.
Jennifer, thank you so much for being with us this afternoon. We at the gcLi feel privileged that you're willing to share your insights about a whole host of things, most importantly about how difference of all sorts ends up influencing the experience of our students and, by extension, the work of our teachers in helping those kids to learn.
Thank you for inviting me. Feels like a privilege. What am I doing? Right now I am working with PreK-12 schools, trying to help those schools address issues of gender and sexuality diversity as that relates to school life. So it's a very particular context. Right now there's a whole lot in many different domains. We've got legal conversations, we've got religious conversations, we have political conversations. And so my work is really how do these issues play out and how should they be engaged with in an educational context?
Yep. And so at the gcLi, one of the things that we tend to focus on is helping teachers engage with their students and help them developing leadership capacity. And so when you think about the diversity that we now understand much more fully about the experience of our students, and for that matter, our teachers factor into that diversity as well.
Yeah.
How do we best help teachers use this insight to create an environment that's safe for students to take the meaningful risks involved with learning to lead? And correspondingly, are there, well, I'll save my second question for a minute, but that question of how do we help teachers use this insight to create safe environments?
Right. Well, I'm going to back up to your observation that we appreciate more than certainly 10 or 15 years ago how much diversity there is amongst our student body, our faculty, our parent body. And yet, while we understand that in a kind of global way, there's some very sort of profound misunderstandings right now about this particular aspect of diversity and these particular kinds of differences in human identity. So the first step is really, there are many teachers who are hungry for a sort of a solid knowledge base about, well, what's the difference between biological sex and gender identity? If we're an all-girls school, is that about biology and anatomy, or is that about identity? Is it about both? So there's some pretty significant pieces of learning that need to happen. And on the one hand, it feels like the students are ahead of us in this regard because their generation is growing up in a very different time. And at the same time, they too are kind of overwhelmed with all this new information, some of which is compelling and accurate, and some of which is just, Facebook is a great example. They went from having 2 gender identities to 52. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of our classic, we had 2 and now we have more than you can even wrap your mind around.
What?
So the first piece for teachers who want to help students provide leadership is to do some of their own learning. And their own identity work, in a way. You can't really help students lead around this kind of complexity and human messiness if we as teachers don't have our own understandings about ourselves. The kids are very tuned in to who we are. And so the second part of your question how to create student leaders, there's so much about modeling from the adults around these issues that absolutely requires a certain level of knowledge and comfort with oneself in order to then be able to be empathic to the challenges students have, and also be able to provide them with the tools they need to understand themselves, understand each other, and then, you know, sort of grapple with the leadership, followership that is, you know, part and parcel of being in a school community.
And so when I think of, or when I talk about teaching leadership, I often reference it as sort of being like in a swamp or in a mess. And that complexity that you referenced, how do we begin to help teachers be comfortable being uncomfortable, in essence? Because as you point to, that modeling is really important. Our students need to be comfortable being uncomfortable if they're going to lead effectively. They need to recognize that they're not always going to have the answers and that they're going to have to navigate the complexity of their communities in ways that help their communities grow and thrive.
Right. Well, there were many pieces to that. So if I forget one, help me come back.
Absolutely.
We have to be more transparent with our own not knowing and our own discomfort. And, you know, some of the most important learning happens when we're uncomfortable. And sometimes people confuse safety with comfort. And our job as teachers is to get right into the swamp with the students around who knows what the right answer is here. It's, you know, education is always about relationships. And if humans are messy in our way of being who we are, then the relationships are messy. And so the swamp is about that. It's about, you know, toggling back and forth between thinking, oh my gosh, this is a mess, to how fascinating is this? How cool is this? That we don't know and we know how to think about it.
Right. And that's, I think, oftentimes the biggest challenge is that as teachers, we like the idea of knowing, as in containing knowledge and being able to use that knowledge in some meaningful way. And what we're really talking about now is understanding. How do we create real understanding about the complexity that we're dealing with? And part of the understanding is coming to terms with the fact that we can't possibly know everything that's happening in a way that allows us to control it or navigate it without any sort of risk.
Right.
And so,
well, I don't want to contradict myself, but I do want to back up from the idea that it's so vast and messy we can't possibly figure it out. And there's a fundamental paradigm shift. If you're going to do the gender and sexuality diversity work the way I believe is most effective, you have to really question and disrupt the binary thinking. And so once you shift to a spectrum model, you know, where we are varied on these dimensions, that disrupts a lot of sort of the scaffolding that we spent long time putting in place in our schools.
Part of your work has been fostering or furthering that model of a spectrum as opposed to a duality or a binary model. And I think that concept can help any number of people feel more comfortable.
I use something called the new diagram of sex, gender, and sexuality as a teaching tool, whether I'm working with teachers or parents or students. And when I present that schema that has spectrums for biological sex and gender identity and gender expression and sexual identity, you know, when I first started using it, there were 4 spectrums. Now there's 7. Right, and so it's evolving as our understanding does. But what's fascinating is when that schema goes up on the screen, the reaction amongst people is varied. So for some, it's like, oh my gosh, I have never thought about it that way. And then for others, it's like, wow, you know, that clears up a little something that I've been struggling with. And then for some other people, it's like, oh my gosh, there I am. There's my lived experience.
is there any critical step you can think of that as an educator I would want to consider as I think about applying that model?
Well, there are a couple of parts to that one, too. Yes, we want to be thinking about development. And if kids have grown up filling in the test bubbles that say male or female, one of the first things we do is hold up another paradigm, hold up another schema to say we're learning more and more that plenty of us do not fall in the binary, and that for some it can be a very fluid experience. So there's some 15-year-olds who know exactly where they are. That's where they landed in the beginning, and that's who they'll be at the end of their lives. Mm-hmm. And for others, there could be movement. Maybe it's just one movement, but it's a big one. And so as teachers, we're first helping them see that there's more than two ways to be. Mm-hmm. And then we can sort of relieve them of that Facebook pressure, which is now you have to pick one. Mm-hmm. Now you have to identify. And there's too much pressure right now for kids to say who they are on these dimensions, and not enough permission to just be. So yes, we need to think about where they are developmentally, offer them a broader way of thinking about that for themselves, and then give them permission to get there when they're ready.
If I'm a teacher trying to deliver what you've just talked about, in other words, create that type of environment for my students, are there, I guess what I'm really looking for is what are the potential risks or potholes or other places where I might get tripped up as I try and do that? Are there any words of wisdom that you can share around navigating this new paradigm?
Well, I think that getting tripped up is part of it. Mm-hmm. And so I'm not suggesting we go in, kind of without any plan or conceptual framework in mind. But there's a lot to be modeled around repairing after a trip up. But I also think that there are ways for us to help kids find themselves by describing a world. So it's not just about you, Sally, but in our discussions of science or history or literature, that there's this great Adrienne Rich quote that says something like, if somebody with the authority of a teacher describes the world and you're not in it, it's like you've looked in the mirror and you don't see yourself. There's this kind of psychic disequilibrium. So we can do a lot indirectly to help kids find themselves by describing a world that's more varied.